Evening, everyone. How's everyone tonight?
Good, thanks.
Okay, good. It's nice to see everyone out and scanning the audience. I can tell we have a diverse cohort of different majors, which is always optimal from my perspective, given that the Vignelli Center, as I like to say, is like Switzerland. We're neutral, like all the different players involved. For those of you, can you hear me okay out there? Roger, is that all right? Okay. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Josh Owen. I am the Vignelli Distinguished Professor of Design and the Director of the Vignelli Center for Design Studies. Welcome to the first event of our Spring 25 Vignelli Design Conversation Series, presented by Design Milk and RIT's Magic Center and made possible in part by the generosity of RIT alumnus Chris Bailey and Bailey Brand Consulting. I'd like to start tonight by offering my thanks to RIT's Magic Center and their team of faculty, staff, and students for their work in organizing the technology and the venue for this evening. I'd also like to recognize the contribution of graphic design student Hannah Neti-Kadden for her beautiful branding for tonight's lecture, as well as the year's series overall and those posters that hopefully grabbed your attention on the walls around RIT. Rochester Institute Technology's Vignelli Center for Design Studies is an international hub for education, research, collaboration, and advocacy, which expands the scope of the programs in the College of Art and Design, School of Design. The facility houses the archive of renowned designers Lella and Massimo Vignelli, whose works are icons of international design. The center and archives sit within RIT's College of Art and Design, which was built on the traditional territory of the Onondaga, or people of the Great Hill. In English, they are known as Seneca people, keepers of the Western Door. They are one of the 6 sovereign nations that make up the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We honor the land on which RIT was built and recognize the unique relationship that the indigenous stewards have with this land. That relationship is the core of their traditions, cultures, and histories. We recognize the history of genocide, colonization, and assimilation of indigenous people that took place on this land. Mindful of these histories, we work towards understanding, acknowledging, and reconciling. As stewards of history and content, we must acknowledge and seek to learn from our context, bad, good, ugly, beautiful. This applies to the Vignelli Center as with any archive. The Vignellis taught us that design is a systematic and scalable framework for solving problems large and small. Their philosophy, design is one, leaves us with the universal message that design is a lens through which we can envision a more inclusive and more sustainable tomorrow. I'm proud to report that tonight we begin a new chapter by integrating recently formed Vignelli Center Student Club into our lecture program. To paraphrase from the club's website, their purpose is to support the mission of the Vignelli Center by providing a mechanism for students to be involved in the center and to grow the knowledge that the Vignellis strived for. By their own definition, the group provides a space for all majors to express and show their passion for the kind of design practices the Vignellis demonstrated with their work. This marks an important acknowledgement that our students wish to expand their own connections to the Vignelli Center to further harness it as a laboratory for their success. For that, I am grateful and very pleased. Beginning tonight, a representative from the Vignelli Center Student Club will introduce our speaker, and after the talk, the group will provide the first 3 questions to prompt the conversation from the audience. So, allow me to introduce Derek Shedleski, who will introduce our speaker tonight. Thank you for coming up, Derek.
Good evening, everybody. Like Josh said, my name is Derek Shedleski. I am a co-founder and the vice president of the Vignelli Center Student Club. Introducing Felicia Ferrone, born in Chicago and educated in the US, founded Fferrone Design in 2001. Her creative practice is shaped by her early career as an architect in Milan, working with renowned figures like Antonio Citterio and Piero Lissoni. This experience instilled in her a belief of interconnectedness in design and context. Fferrone's work has been exhibited, distributed, and published widely with commissions for brands like Audi and Macallan. She's featured in Woman Made, Great Women Designers 2021, has juried for Cannes Lions Festival, Archiproducts, and Core 77 Design Awards. As clinical professor and director of the undergraduate studies in industrial design at the University of Illinois, Chicago, Fferrone encourages students to combine critical thinking with deep research. She previously served as the director of graduate studies in the industrial design program at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And she taught at the School of Art Institute of Chicago in 2010 to 2015. Felicia Ferrone, everybody.
Hello. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and most of all for your wonderful invitation here. I had the pleasure to tour the campus today and meet some of you, and it's just truly an extraordinary university, and it's a pleasure and honor to be here tonight with you, and I thank you all for coming. I know you're all very busy. So, okay. So, as I was introduced, I sort of began my studio work in 2001 when I very slowly started the second version of my career as I sort of downshifted in scale in terms of the scale of architecture that I was working at. And that's when I designed my very first product, actually, while I was still living in Milan. And sort of in 2010 is when I formalized my studio, which is Fferrone. And my studio and I am so sort of inextricably linked because it is through founding my studio and brand that it performs as a vehicle for me. So that I do work because I don't do a lot of work actually that's commission driven. So the majority of my work is actually all self-generated and work that I choose to make and put out into the world. So looking back, I would say, and something I guess actually ever more important to me at this time in my life is really trying to understand what is my reason for designing. And what I find myself continually drawn to is this idea of beauty and emotion, and through the extraordinary, and the idea of just the extraordinary, the thing that is not the sort of assumptions we have in our mind. And I think how I got there, I can look back now. I danced for a while, I never looked like this. But the thing that it taught me is the attention to detail and the rigor. Because it's not about the obvious grand jeté, but it's the attention to detail and time in training and rehearsals to get the finger positions right, even. And even if you see the lift of her chin, just so. And so it's that, I think, attention that I bring into all of my design work, where it's really about not the obvious, but how it's finished. Because it's that finishing that makes all the difference from something from being good to extraordinary. Something else that is sort of just almost a religious practice for me is paying attention to everything that's around me. This is something that really, when I teach, I weave into the curriculum as a weekly exercise. But it's this idea of being out in the world and really paying attention to everything that's around. inspiration all around us. There's beauty, there's answers to problems you're trying to solve in your studio practice. And they can be anonymous fire hydrant pieces, they could be, you know, a tombstone monument, you know, a paver, you know, they can be important pieces by Carlo Scarpa and Castelvecchio, for example. But just, again, this extraordinary moments, you know, or a simple curb cut, like the one here from Milan. And, you know, I'm very much, I guess, you know, form for me is everything. And so, you know, I very much rely and go back to these foundational elements of proportion, line, composition, scale, tension, order, and rigor. This is also something I've thought a lot about to sort of set up how you're, you know, how I think about my work going forward, is really sort of expanding this notion of sustainability. And by reading, you know, knowing more of the Vignellis, language differently. This is sort of a work in progress in terms of language, but, you know, again, very similar ideas of this idea of how sustainability could be through the emotion of design. You know, this idea of timelessness, enduring, but it's all about the form. So the reason I picked the Vernon Panton chairs, I think it's a great, I always use it when I'm sort of in conversation with people. The idea that this piece, I would argue, is completely sustainable, in that if it ended up on the sidewalk, any place in the world, discarded by its owner, someone, they don't even have to be a designer, they don't have to know anything about design history, they don't need to know who designed it, but it's going to speak to them. And so it's going to move on then to its next life. And so I think if we think about design in terms of how do we sort of embed these intrinsic qualities, something, the sustainability issue, and you know, it's sort of, it morphs slightly. So I think this is a great example. This was actually in the Museum of Glass in Murano, one of the islands behind Venice, where this is a glass vessel from the 2nd and 3rd century. But I found it just extraordinary. And when I come across a piece that sort of has these formal qualities to it, it almost becomes like this visceral reaction in my body. It's sort of almost pre-verbal. I still kind of struggle to find the language that really sort of addresses what it is that I'm seeing and how it's sort of affecting my emotions. But just, I would argue that if you saw this anywhere, not knowing its, you know, lineage or anything, that there's just something that would draw you to it. And I think that's the power of design. And that's, you know, what I would hope everyone would aspire to. This is another, I think, great example of, you know, this, to me, the story I make up in my head of this, obviously there's a great amount of rigor to this piece, you know, and that it's, you know, the top surface and the bottom are very tightly controlled in a very geometric shape, and yet it almost seems as though someone was sort of playing with the vessel, right, by seeing what would happen if they sort of push in the walls of this glass. So these are just all some of I don't normally share sort of things that live in my camera, even though I guess that's what Instagram is for in many ways, but to me, it's just like breath, you know, finding these extraordinary little things, be it a random truck of fantastic proportions and color, to something at a flea market in a case, and not for its religious significance, but for its proportions, this very sort of chunky proportion with the ring, and yet then there's this sort of like very little Baroque cherub on it, and this creating this perfect contrast of proportion and balance between the two. I'm an absolute lover of things that are anonymous. This is this wonderful little leather case, and it's, you know, about 3 inches long, just enough kind of for a credit card, but just these proportions, these very tightly things, to, you know, a mailbox. And this is where then sort of this idea of like objects sort of, where does an object stop and architecture begin? Also in Milan, you know, and it could be obviously, you know, a sort of considered historically important Joseph Hoffman glass at the MoMA. But, you know, the way I sort of really like, I'm always studying and sort of examining and reverse engineering, but just this like really strict geometry that sort of then is in balance with this sort of slightly more organic sort of patterning. To again, this idea of these, you know, sort of the extraordinary, unexpected. This is actually an alum of ours who, for his senior thesis, did a whole garment collection, even though we were an ID program. And he's since gone on to do his own thing. But there are these wonderful pants he did, and as you walk, the eyes sort of blink. And then, of course, you know, just discovering all the wonders that nature produces. From this flower in Ecuador to sort of this depiction, which is in the Pabst Mansion in Milwaukee. You know, it's sort of 1800s wood carving, Bavarian wood carving. But it was, I find it so extraordinary, again, of this complexity and balance. You know, another piece that I've long loved of Jaime Phaidon's for Yadro, here with the birds, and then Stella, my cat. With a Joe Colombo piece. And, you know, this is something else that I just, you know, it took my breath away. It's a flashlight by Emilio Ambas that was just this fall in a show in the MoMA. And you can just make out the parting seam here. You can see, so it actually rotates on that bias and then becomes a 90-degree sort of point for the flashlight. And you can also have it assume these other positions, but just its delicateness. I mean, it's kind of almost like a larger version of like an electric lighter, like a cigarette lighter. So it has these really delicate proportions, again, this idea of the tension between the thinness of the edge, the beautiful ellipse, and the overall scale of it. This was also something that completely caught my attention. It was just a random bracelet on a woman's arm. But it was so, you can tell how small it is based on the way her skin's enlarged. It was just such a fine little random detail. Just as this candle, as I removed it from a cake, I realized it had its own sort of structure to it. You know, in this very delicate, self-supporting sort of moment. You know, this again was the opposite. This is a very large scale candle. It was in a religious candle shop in Quito, Ecuador, and it just, you know, maybe the colors don't speak to me, but there was this idea of scale, and again, scale, proportion, tension, you know, all of the real fundamentals that go into good design, regardless of the type of design you're doing, UI, UX, you know, product. This again, I think are things that I find fascinating. One is a transition between two lines on the subway in Chicago, and one is a 17th century building in north of Italy, but just how one is, you know, completely symmetrical, and the other, this wonderful composition. Here, and even how they so artfully, you know, hung the paintings in just the exact proportions and everything, and how it holds that tension and the eye and the overall composition. Other things, you know, from this is the corner of the Louvre and this pattern, which makes me think of Memphis. Well, Memphis, you know, vice versa. You know, to this sort of anonymous object again of this beautiful doorstop. It's in the Villa Necchi in Milan, to, you know, alternative uses of materials that I just find to be sort of extraordinarily inspiring. This was actually two pieces at the Decorative Arts Museum in Paris. One is a seal ring, and with these multiple seals. It's actually a pendant. I long thought it was a ring, and but it was such a beautiful functional object. And in some ways, when I discovered it was a pendant, it took me a while to find it because I kept typing in ring and nothing was showing up. And in some ways, I feel like being a pendant actually makes the design overall weaker in the way of, as opposed to this thing that you wear and it's part of you and it's your, you know, it's your signature of whatever it is. And so it's, in some ways, it's like, how do you, I guess I'm just redesigning it. But, and then this, again, extraordinary garment by Iris Van Harpen, just the overall form, but also that idea of, again, challenging the archetype of, obviously what a material can be and what can comprise volume. Having come from a background in architecture, this is this house. It was done in the 40s outside of Chicago, actually, the Schweikert House. And just looking again at the composition and the material changes and sort of just, how tightly controlled everything. Nothing is left to chance. And I think as designers, everything has to be questioned constantly to really make sure that what you finish on has been exhaustively considered. Again, other things that I find delightful. This is actually my campus, UIC, done by Walter Netsch for SOM, Skidmore, Owens and Merrill. And even wonky proportions can also have their delight. It isn't like there's one canon, one formula, per se. I had someone from out of town that I was touring through campus, and I had no idea that there was the staircase in another building. And obviously you can tell the rails were put in after the fact, so they don't have that level of wonder and surprise, nor attention to detail and care. And then just in the strange, there can be absolute beauty and joy and delight and emotion in these unusual moments. The Armory in New York, which caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting it. And then to find this beautiful pattern, this arch pattern in the brick, way up here. So and again, it's that idea of like really looking as you're out in the world. This is along the Charles River in Prague, and these portholes, which are just how wonderful to have little spaces behind these rotating portals. And this idea again of a lot of my work, because a lot of my work really kind of explores the sort of challenge, how do you challenge an archetype? Or even, a watch, a vintage Pops watch, which can be worn on a classic wrist thing, but its original design was to be embedded through its housing case. And challenging how things can be, what are surfaces, how can things be applied to surfaces. Just as this very three-dimensional tile, that's Joe Ponti, a building in Milan. Marie Oppenheim, whose work very much inspires me, just in terms of everything about it, honestly. To bizarre, unexpected things in nature, to donuts. There's this place in Chicago that has these, this is a normal sized donut just for scale. But it's just like, there's something, it's again, this like wonder and delight of the unexpected. So that's just kind of like a tiny little snippet of how I go about the world through my eyes, looking at things. So as mentioned, I am a designer through formal training as an architect. I'm an entrepreneur, I'm an educator and leader in the program, and I really can't separate one out from the other because they each feed the other, and I feel incredibly privileged to have that. My practice feeds my teaching feeds my practice, and that entrepreneurship really sort of does that as well. After I graduated from college in the US, I moved to Milan, and that's really where I discovered design. I'd always been sketching all through architecture school, things that would be considered furniture, and no one ever said, hey, that's a field you can study. That's its own thing. Never once said anyone. And so when I moved to Milan, the furniture fair happens every year in April, and for those of you who don't know, it's the moment the entire world descends upon Milan for 1 week, to just look at design, show design, experience it for like 7 days straight, 12 hours a day, easily, if not more. And it's like this. in large parts of the city. And so that's where I discovered design. I had no idea it existed. You know, and of course in these, you have these wonderful palazzos and these things that you can experience, you know, that again are very sort of theatrical and experiential. But it's this now that it's this one piece that I can look back to that I saw in 1995. And it was by Juried Design, and it was their functional tile. And now looking back with hindsight, this to me is really the thing that shaped how I think about design. Because it's just the ubiquitous 4-inch by 4-inch, most generic, most, you know, it's most economical, least value in terms of intrinsic value, is the 4x4 tile. And yet they made it smart. You know, they turned it into ladle holders. They turned it into, you know, control panels and drains and, you know, gas lines. And it was this idea of, yes, of course a tile is a system, but they sort of made it into a smarter system. And so this idea that an object, you know, just how an object never really exists on its own. So obviously I started learning about design through my time in Milan. And then I began to understand it as a system and a context. Very much like you think about, or at least as I was trained in architecture, you know, a building, you need to consider obviously the context. And so this is when I started, it was sort of through this lens that I began my very first piece. And it was after one dinner in particular, you know, classic Italian thing, 20 friends go out to dinner and it's a million drinks and plates and everything. And to me it was just this visual chaos at the end. So I thought, how can I kind of clean this up and yeah, how can I clean up the visual? So I started thinking about this idea of like one vessel, you know, but this, you know, sort of proportion of 1/3, 2/3, water side or wine side. And then this idea of, you know, that sort of gets expanded into a series of bowls as well. And at the time I had designed a smaller version, like kind of like a grappa glass of liqueur size. So like most designers, I was living in Milan at the time, and the only way I knew to be a designer was to, you know, get a licensing sort of agreement. And so I was actually very fortunate. Well, the first contract just kind of ran out. They just kind of sat on it. So I went back, so that ended, and so I went to another place, and right away they picked it up, but they would only do the one piece. And I had this in my mind, this whole system. And yet, you know, when I was so excited, first thing, I opened the catalog, and that was the image. And I was just like, oh, you can't really see what it is. And I had to do all the, you know, the writing for it and stuff, which is probably normal, but to me it seemed not so normal. So nothing much came of that. Second time they, you know, next year they did a new catalog. I was excited thinking, this is gonna be it. It's really gonna tell the story of the piece and it's gonna make sense. And again, this was the photography. And I thought, it still doesn't, you know, this isn't working. And of course, for a design license, you know, you don't get paid as the pieces sell. You don't get like a book advance. So, you know, if the images are bad, why would anyone buy them? So I found myself in this, questioning these realities of licensing and royalties, and realizing how little control and agency you would have. That's also over, you know, timelines, distribution, production, quality, all of those kinds of things. So that's really sort of that third piece that kind of came into play for me. So, and really understanding these two components that I think are fundamental to this idea of design entrepreneurship. So one is empowerment. So process of becoming stronger and more confident. And this idea of agency, that you have control over your actions and your consequences, and that you don't necessarily know the answer, but that you feel like you can arrive at it at some point. And then I think there are two other sort of ingredients that go in, this idea of like tenacity and being resourceful, which I think generally designers have in spades, right? We all love solving problems and exploring things that haven't existed before. So I went to the company and I said, just so you know, let's terminate the contract and I'm going to do this myself. And so that's when that was in 2010, because it takes like 15 years to, be overnight. And it allowed me then to kind of control all the elements I couldn't control. And so I was able to do the entire collection as I imagined. And, really started to express this idea of this continual datum, where the small bowl is the same height as these base elements, and then, the total height of this is this, where you have these repeating proportions. So it really becomes an object, but it's in a larger system. And then, of course, with, once it has liquid in it, it becomes this other graphic element, and it's almost like a deconstructed tartan plaid, almost. And even if you just have a little sip of something in there, again, it still has this very graphic quality to it. And so this is where it began. This was a trade show, the New York Now trade show, which is still in existence. We were actually in the lobby. We weren't even up in the trade show. But it was through the American Design Club, which for those of you who were interested, it still exists, and it's a wonderful thing. And Calamite, I think, is always looking for great young designers who have just a few things to be produced. And this is Kai Williams and Chen Chen. They got their start, for anyone who knows their work as well. And then it ended up here. And the reason I say that is because, one, had I not taken that first leap to take my work back in my own hands, under my own control, that it wouldn't have ended up here. Because from the images and the way it was sort of presented, it never would have gone anywhere. And, as creatives, we all know we have this passion and this vision for what we want to achieve. We see it. We see what the thing is finished in our head, even if the thing isn't there yet. And so I think it's really important to not be afraid of that. It's challenging, but that, if you're persistent enough, I believe one can get there. So my work is all sort of, I sort of am in design and entrepreneurship, IT, teaching, all these things, exhibit design. I've done exhibit design as a career, been in architecture, some interiors. But it's sort of the thing I'm most fascinated by is this idea of like challenging archetypes and sort of through this idea of, design almost as small scale architecture, being inspired by architecture, objects as systems. And then again, always redefining the form, but maintaining the function. Just like the Revolution collection of glassware, the double-ended. So, of course, fascinated by this. Again, something eternal. This will, everyone will agree this is a special building, with this idea of sustainability and things. So this amazing minimalist sort of essential coffered ceiling, and of course the oculus, which is extraordinary. So I've long been inspired by it. I don't use a lot of color materials in my work, although that may be changing. But so I was given a solo show with a gallery, volume gallery, right when I kind of left my secure day job to start teaching and my own practice. And so I decided to sort of use this as a jumping off point of inspiration for a piece of furniture, which came, then the shift came to be where I was trying to find a way to sort of control what felt like sort of this wild pattern floor, using 3 of the 4 marbles, and then of course with the oculus, which sort of, it was interesting how just simply having this void in the center really sort of made the table more of a subject, or more of a subject than an object, where you sort of interact with it in a way that, you can't just leave that on there forever. Your water bottle or your, remote control or something, like, there's this thing where I believe everything should be completely functional, but that it sort of allows you to use it, but then it wants to sort of go back to its original state. This was another example of architecture, the Marina Towers by Bertrand Goldberg in Chicago, that inspired this collection, the Flight collection, with these ideas of the proportions here. So some of the things I look at as well as beyond just, form inspiring other form, but behaviors, of course. This was actually a flower vase designed for my husband because he would always buy flowers every week. And, you know, sometimes they'd be a small amount, sometimes it'd be a sprig or two. And so really kind of looking at that behavior. And all my students know, you know, my favorite thing is as soon as you have an idea, prototype it as quickly as you can. You know, printer paper and Scotch tape, cardboard are my absolute favorite immediate go-to materials, which resulted in the Banner collection. And so this obviously Banner inspired by Ikebana. But this idea of, you know, both how you use it from a single stem to a smaller bunch, but also in its asymmetry, it allows you to hopefully never grow tired of it, because you can position it in one way for a while and then rotate it and it feels fresh and new and like a completely different sort of experience. And then obviously when it's all the vessels are full, it has this whole other thing. And so again, by being able to continually live with it in a way that sort of presents itself in a new way to you in your living environment, the idea that it's sort of the attachment hopefully grows so that you wish to keep it forever because you don't grow bored of it. This was the double vase, and the reason it's called the double vase is because there's actually a bud vase hidden within. So again, you can use it in two different ways. One of the things that allows me to do what I do is that I don't do anything with a mold. So I don't have that upfront heavy investment cost. So everything I do is very labor intensive, very handmade. So, you know, obviously the tubes get cut on the bias and then, you know, it's just, you know, sort of requires highly skilled craftspeople. My glassware is all done exclusively in the Czech Republic, and then anything else is done in Chicago. This was another piece that I did for myself. A lot of the work sort of generates from my own needs. But this whole idea of, and you all know very well, in inclement weather, we all have places to put our coats, but then usually the wet shoes and umbrellas and stuff is on some other thing for some reason, as though the two activities don't happen simultaneously the moment you walk inside. And so it was this whole idea of sort of a place to unify those moments. So again, quickly, you know, my broom, some paper, some cardboard to start testing things out. And then sort of how to sort of expand an idea, you know, with something as simple as 2 colors, which then can produce 4 different opportunities altogether. And then I still love print, you know, but this whole idea of kind of a catch-all side table piece that ended up in sort of its prototyping stage, and it's so critical, and you have such amazing resources. But I almost feel like very often, because this happens time and time again, where it's like I get the real prototype back, and I'm almost a little disappointed because it looks like the thing I made, which is good. You want it to be like, you don't want big surprises when you finally invested in the thing with the fabricator or whoever it is. So in some ways, you know, that's how it should be. And then this is kind of the finished little catch-all. Another point of inspiration for me, and this again probably really goes back to architecture, where I feel like that's, at least when I studied again, very woven in the fabric of curriculum, is this idea of precedent studies, things that came before, design history obviously. And these, you know, this was in Venice, obviously these ideas like mirrors and candlelight to create illumination throughout the space, and then sort of my minimal version, which is polished stainless steel backplate that creates the mirrored effect of the candle wall sconce. And other times, and this is actually what I'm going to be doing sort of over the next few months, is really sort of experimenting with materials I haven't experimented with, but all my material is, all of the glassware is made with borosilicate glass. And this was the first time I used fluted borosilicate, which previously had only ever been used in the lighting industry. And so it was really the first time that this material sort of transcended into the everyday domestic object that one would interact with. And being my second glassware collection, the first being the Revolution, completely, so minimal, I felt like nothing else could be sort of removed, and reduced. So I thought, okay, let's go the other way. And so I thought, okay, what is sort of the thing that's sort of most extreme, sort of maximalist approach? And the Margot collection was born from that. And interestingly, now I can see that they were sort of the binaries, and I've been filling in everything in between throughout the year. So the fluting is actually on the interior. And so, but anytime there's a bottom to it, that actually becomes the clear glass for how it's all made. This was another collection, the tulip, that sort of again explored this idea of sort of these intersecting volumes, and again kind of very architectural and column as stem. Something that also came out of a need was this idea of also looking at combining materials between the fluted and the smooth wall borosilicate, and how we might change the material. Normally the pictures are plastic that we know, and they get scratched and kind of unsightly over time. And so how you can sort of use sort of technology, but sort of in a way that allows you sort of more use out of it. And this is just another example I wanted to share with you, the May collection, which again, kind of these ideas of like the proportion and the tension in the two different materials, but used in a different language. So oddly, a lot of my work has been used in film, and they all tend to be sci-fi. And so in some ways, I hope that sort of supports this idea of sustainability in this new sort of definition. In this case, the May collection actually sort of became these like supporting characters in the film. If anyone's seen the film, they sort of were part of the plot, which was super fun to see. And at this point, it's kind of been fun to see how many times things show up. But they're often the only thing on set, and they sort of hold this sort of like signifier. And I think that's all because, again, this idea of like pushing boundaries and challenging archetypes. And so they sort of live in this timelessness, and because they sort of are not of a time, because they conceive of the object, the everyday object, but in a way we haven't thought of. This was another project I wanted to share, where the challenge was, what's sort of the most audacious thing you can think of in terms of a glass. And so I thought, well, a glass with a hole in it, and it sort of creates this, effect. Obviously, if you have a liqueur in it, it sort of opens it up. Because the double walls, because it's opening up through the inner cylinder as well as the outer wall. And this is probably one of my most recent projects, the Ernestine. So I did this. There's a vodka company, Chopin Vodka, who had long admired my work, I found out. And they wanted to do something together. And so we were thinking, what could we do? Okay, something around like a martini glass. And so all of my research always begins like, what is the origin of the typology of the object? And so I looked into the origin of the martini glass and came to discover the iconic martini glass that we all know, the archetypal one, was actually introduced in Paris at the exhibition of decorative and industrial arts in 1925. So it's celebrating its centennial this year. So I thought, what a great place to start. So it was like, okay, how do I sort of challenge that? Because that is so, what are you gonna do to it? It's stripped away and things. And they had suggested to me they wanted to do something with like a set of 4, and I've never really done that. And this idea of how can you create a collection of 4 things that are equal but different? And so I sort of had this idea that maybe it's through sort of the idea of the stem. How do you sort of like, you know, twist this idea of the archetype? And so it became this collection of 4. So the stem now becomes almost like an architectural column-like element. Each one's different. Each one feels very different in the hand, which I think is also a lovely experience. And then you can see here sort of how they read through the glass as well. So sort of the final object project I'll quickly show is I was invited by Food and Wine magazine in 2014, along with some chefs and artists to redesign the archetypal wine bottle. So I thought, great, right up my alley, love this. And I went back in the history, looked at the evolution of the wine bottle. Didn't evolve very much. I couldn't figure, I was just like, I can't find my way into this project. And kind of at the 9th hour of it, before the deadline, I realized if you look down on it, top view in plan, the aperture, the opening, and the body of the vessel are always concentric. And so I thought, aha, so what if I move that so that they're tangential? And the moment I did that, the project then sort of like unfolded before me. And so, it had this interesting shape, fine, and then I realized it nested. And I was like, that's really interesting. So I ended up being able to achieve a utility patent, and then I have some design patents on it. But it starts to open up, this sort of like trifecta of packaging. And so you can store twice as much, basically, put twice as much in packaging, or reduce the packaging by basically half. And then it also, which then means carbon footprint in shipping. So that's a huge thing. I was just reading something else last night. That industry is always trying to kind of crack that code, and they don't seem to find a way. But, just by reducing, the amount, you would reduce almost like 50% in shipping. But then it also opens up a real infinite visual communication opportunity, because you sort of have 4 facades, you have 4 profiles. So you have the flat wall, you have the sort of like belly wall, you have the sort of right and the left hip to it. And so we started experimenting with just some wine labels that were existing to see what happened. So it's on the right side versus the left side, or the front side. Even how these would translate on the sides to the straight wall. And then just sort of playing around with different things. So again, how just like a simple small gesture sort of opens up all these other possibilities for a piece. So where does this all sort of conclude in a way? So, I've had many different jobs, many different scales of practice, from very large scale architecture, down to, a glass. So I had long wanted to do something in Milan, since that's where I discovered Milan. I used to live there for a long time. It's always held a very special place for me. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to attempt this. But it's a little bit like screaming into a hurricane. And so it's sort of like, how do you do it in a way that makes it worthwhile? And it's the world stage, so you also have to do it in a way that, can sort of do that. So I didn't know where I was going to do stuff just yet, but I started looking at, glassware and art. For some reason, I started looking at that. And, came across, of course, still lifes, like Dutch still lifes from the 1600s, which were not everyday object, but kind of, And they happen to also be similar objects to, things I'd find at thrift stores and vessels I had. So that was sort of my in to this. So the project sort of took several roads, where it was a series of still lifes to sort of explore this idea. I very much inspired by, of course, Yves Klein, Vanessa Beecroft, Daniel Spaweri, the still lifes. And the thing that was important to me with a lot of these pieces that I've been collecting is, again, this idea of these, there was just something that spoke to me. It was just, you know, I could feel it in my body. I'd, you know, almost kind of become breathless when I'd find these gorgeous objects at like an estate sale or a thrift store. And then by, you know, flocking them in the blue and removing its materiality, the time got removed from it and its place in history. And what resulted was just this heightened sense of form. So it's quite challenging to find a space in Milan, and you know, something that's affordable as well. And I happened upon this amazing 15th century villa, and it had never been used for salone, which is like unheard of, because it's just a little outside of the center, or the usual like areas. And so I set about sort of kind of really trying to take over as much as I could. So, you know, they had these stands, so sort of using them as these like punctuation marks, because you know, my brand was sort of known, kind of not known, so I needed to sort of, I wanted to really sort of, because I'd been doing this for a long time, really kind of make a statement with, you know, the full collection. So I did a timeline from my very first piece to the last, and it was wonderful to kind of be able to see and be able to talk about how each one was, you know, a challenge in some way. Maybe it was archetypal, or maybe it was in terms of production and how something is made, in terms of like joining materials or a process that they had never used before. But, you know, the craftsmen were always willing to sort of experiment and try things. You know, usually the first answer is, we can't do that. And then like a week later, they'd be like, we think, nah, maybe we can, well, you know, and then, you know, next thing I know, they're sending me a sample. So, and then it sort of culminated in this, again, inspired by, you know, Daniel Sporeri and Vanessa Beecroft and Judy Chicago and her dinner party. This idea of sort of this whimsical fantasy dinner. And so the table is actually 4 feet wide and 35 feet long. And it begins in a very sort of proper dinner place setting. And again, where these, you know, just these gorgeous shapes and forms, and sort of compiling these narratives with the pieces to the end of the party, where everything is kind of at the wonderful, joyous mayhem ending, and then everything in between. And then for the press preview, I commissioned blue spirulina truffles, because blue doesn't have the fishy flavor like the green does, and so that it happened to be like perfectly intent with the flogging, which was wonderful. So it was, again, this idea of how do you take this entire experience and bring it down, not even, you know, to the soundtrack, but even to what you're eating. So just a quick, so you can start to see, because there was this whole idea of it started to then, you know, become more and more whimsical, these sort of animals being introduced, the sort of gnocchi, soy sauce piece, but just this idea of like everything on the table represented just some form and beauty and peace that is truly timeless. And while, you know, there were maker marks on all of them as far as the manufacturer, it wasn't about the star designer behind them, but these pieces live on because of their sort of intrinsic formal qualities. And then another component to it as well was this idea of, you know, sort of a press kit, invites, and then for me it was really important to do, I love the idea of postcards, and so taking the still lifes and translating them into a series of postcards that, with a proper postcard stand, like you'd find at a tourist destination, where people, everyone who came to see the show could just take whatever postcards they wanted as sort of like a pro memoria. And so this invitation, this formal one, would go to press, and it was a bio, me, the photographer, the villa, because some people, many people in Milan didn't know the existence of this villa. This was the actual invite then. It was a thick cardstock, and then we had the edges blued. And then the series of postcards on them. And, to do this, we probably have, 14 different mock-ups of, everything. Every time we have to refine something or make it thinner or, play around with these different things that we do in studio. So anyway, I just kind of want to talk about this. But the idea of, like, as designers, we're so uniquely qualified to explore entrepreneurship or design entrepreneurship, because you do have the vision, right? You are creative. You have a natural curiosity, which is, again, why you're probably in this. And this idea of, like, fulfillment. Like, we can really dig into finding things that fulfill us. If it's a change in scale or it's a change in material. One thing you do have to think about is, like, your tolerance for risk. And that kind of goes back to that idea of, like, empowerment and agency. And what's motivating you? What's motivating you to do the work that you're doing? And this idea of, like, confidence really just comes with practice. It's not something you wake up with. It's something that, sort of slowly over time. So, I think I stress this all the time in my own teaching, but the importance of knowing the history and context, and making opportunities for yourself. And that it's okay to feel whatever, fill in the blank, scared, intimidated, like an imposter, whatever, but that you just do it anyway. And that's the thing I try to really stress to all my students, whether they're starting out in their career or they're graduating, is that, whatever it is, you just have, just do it. Just move forward with that thing. So, great. Thank you so much for being here, and
Thank you so much, Felicia. We have time for some questions. As I mentioned before, we have the Vignelli Center Student Club to kick off the Q&A with 3 of their questions. So I'll throw it to you in the back.
I was just wondering, when you find yourself working with clients, do you find a need to find a balance between your own style and what the client wants? And if you do, kind of, how do you go about finding that?
yes, I actually do very little client work. I usually only take things where I know I have a great amount of freedom. I think my preference is always still, I know this doesn't really answer your question, but I choose to be my own client so that I have full range. Because what I find with clients, like all of you, imagine or have experienced, like there's always elements that you can't control, like the narrative they want to tell, or the photography, or the distribution, and I have not been successful in some of those cases, and just been frustrated with those things, which is why, again, I just choose over and over to just do my own work primarily. I'm probably not the best person to ask about that. Josh, as well, more you have far more experience and skill at navigating.
I don't know about that, but thank you anyway. Next.
What makes glass such a special material?
It's just it happened randomly. It wasn't like, oh, this is my material. Because again, as coming from architecture, and really, I did the Revolution collection, but then my next, 5 things one was a light. It was like all different materials, and so it was sort of the reason. I think the way I ended up sort of so anchored in the glass is because of what I was doing with the forms, challenging the archetypes and things. It resonated with people. And when I was doing it, the field was empty. Now the field is very dense. The work is sort of brought on this it's brought on the density. But, and so, you know, that's what people are really resonating with. And again, it goes back to, because I think it's sort of, is the unexpected. So, and now I know how to, you know, I understand how it works. I'm actually going to be going next week to work with them and just kind of like, because usually what I do is I sort of conceive of something, send drawings, and the piece comes back. I've never sort of been there, you know, could we try this? What about this? You know, and so I'm actually hoping to really sort of get into something that's a little more process driven and other opportunities. But I do, in these kind of next few months, really hope to sort of expand in a way where it's not just, you know, people see me for the glass per se, even if it's just for my own experimentation.
One more up here.
You talk a lot about being self-generated if you work. Like you said, you don't work with many clients. And I wanted to know how you push through that creativity wall that a lot of designers hit. Is it just like the research of history? Or, you know, like you said, noticing all the design around you? Is it just those, or do you have is there another aspect to pushing past that wall of creativity?
Right. I would say that's probably the two main things, which is why I emphasize them so much in my teaching practice as well. And just finding, you know, needs, my own needs, you know, or needs of others that I see around. Yeah, I would say kind of looking at those, you know, those aspects. On two projects that happen to be with partners, there was sort of a verbal prompt, which I've never worked that way, you know, and I find that kind of intimidating. But the way they turned out, now I'm kind of interested in exploring that. Like, what if I just set kind of a random verbal prompt for myself, you know, as a generator? And then I always go back to my history and the, you know, origins of the typology and really understanding. And when I say design history also, I mean like making sure that, you know, if I'm designing this, that I understand what's everything that's come before it and after it and all of that. So, but yeah, I mean, you can, you know, you can find your way in anywhere and everywhere.
So in terms of producing your glassware, I remember you said the first piece you made, a double-sided glass, you got it produced by an agency. I was wondering how you got in contact with them and how that whole process worked.
Mm-hmm. So getting a licensing deal agreement contract is usually that's the really challenging part. But you know, I'm a big proponent of, again, it's okay to feel scared, just do it anyway. It was a random email. Or you know, I think the first one was I had gotten the Revolution collection because I'd prototyped them first on my own. I'd gotten them prototyped. I hired a photographer. I did all the styling. You know, we shot it. I sent it around to all the magazines, and they picked it up. And so one of the editors loved it, and she said, "Oh, do you have someone who's going to produce it?" I literally just thought, I'm just going to try this thing. I had no plan beyond like I'm going to make the prototype and photograph it. And so she was like, "Oh, I know so-and-so, and he's always looking for, you know, young designers and new stuff." And so that kind of came through there. That one sort of didn't lead anywhere in the end, ultimately. I mean, the contract they didn't produce the piece. I had the contract, but it didn't produce the piece. And then the second one, someone had said, "This might be a good company for you." And again, it was just, "Hi, I'm so-and-so." And, you know, it was just that, you know, sort of out of the blue for them. So I think, again, this idea of like, just try it. If you have something, you know, reach out, don't be afraid. Because they can always say no or just not get back to you and you're no worse off.
So you talked a lot about challenging archetypes, and I think as students we sort of feel a lot. I don't want to talk for everybody, so I guess I'll just talk for myself. The challenging archetype sort of idea, for me at least, is very much centered around everything's already been made. How can I break away from everything that's already been invented? But just like that reasoning, what ends up coming out of that thinking is something that's still very much tied to the archetype by being opposed to it. In challenging archetypes, how do you completely break away?
So I look at the thing that's the constant, and then I think, okay, they're all doing this. How can we flip it? And so I think that's, I think that's it. You know, you got to find that thing that's like the thing that makes it the archetype in everyone's mind, and then find a new way to do that thing, while still maintaining the same core function, like the wine bottle. It was like, you know, that move was so simple. Anyone in history could have done it, but no one did. You know, and it was something as simple as that, right? But the thing that was consistent was both the aperture and the vessel were concentric always in plan. So.
Hi. You mentioned designing in context. I was wondering if you could elaborate on what you meant by that.
Yes, yes, I didn't really address that. So, so it's really like if you're designing a piece of, you know, furniture or something, really thinking about like how do you interact with it and where would it live? If you're doing a side table, okay, what's the height? What do you got to think about it in terms of the sofa. You're doing, you know, a coffee tree or, you know, the coat hall tree thing. It's like, okay, well, how many pairs of shoes would I have on this thing? Therefore, how big would it be? And okay, you know, you settle on, you know, X number of pairs of shoes and boots. You figure out what that is, but then it's like, okay, but it can't be this big because no one has an entrance, you know, that's 4 times that size, right? So then you have to think about the context and then go back to your original design and adjust accordingly. So it's always, you always have to kind of plug it back in as the check and balance system, you know, to continually refine your design. So whatever you're doing, it always has to kind of go back into where it's going to live. I think that's the thing that's always detrimental with students is that we get so accustomed to our wonderful, powerful computers and the vacuum that is, you know, some 3D program, that we forget that thing lives in real life. And that the bottle has to fit in a hand, you know, and has to be light enough to pick up and portable and all of that.
What were the props in the Ultramarines cube made of? What was that wood?
Oh, so it's flocking.
Okay.
So flocking's like the little fuzzy bunny stuff or inside like a little jewelry box. So it's actually a process I did on all the pieces. So yeah, it's flocking.
One more up here? No?
You know, it's interesting. You know, it's that thing when you're doing your own stuff. And maybe this has happened to you. Like that never occurred to me. Oh wait, I've got this motif. Like it wasn't until like way later I was like, oh. You know, so that was sort of I don't know, unexpected. It's kind of embarrassing to think that I wasn't intentional about it and or didn't realize it. But yeah, probably because I was working at it in a way that was like thinking about it, the problem I was trying to sort of solve for. But yes, they are. You picked up on the motif before I did, so that's great.
If you could go back and do one thing differently in your career, what would you change,
Ooh.
if anything?
Oh. That's a I don't know. I started my transition very late into design. I was in my late 30s easily. I don't know. I mean, you know, I've made lots of mistakes. I've taken risks that didn't always pay off. I don't know, it's hard to say because it's so clear to me. It's like stepping stones across like a creek or something. Like while you're at it, it's, you know, but then when you look back and it's like, oh, that's so obvious. Like that led to that, led to that, led to that, led to that. Like way back when we met a designer we have in common, you know, and here I stand before you, you know, like, so I don't know. I don't think, I actually don't believe in the word failure. It's just not part, like it just, you iterate. We're designers. Again, you've got the superpower where you just iterate. There's no such thing as failing is when you just don't try. That's failing. But like, barring that, I don't know. I think everything leads to something and you always are gleaming something and it's building towards something bigger. So, yeah, it's not like everything was all like perfect and amazing and smooth. But yeah, I just had to make a really big decision in my company and sort of restructure, and it was a really hard decision to make, and it was lots of hand wringing up to the like very end. I was like, I don't know, maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't, and you just don't know, and then your only chance is to move on. So, and I think that's fine. You'll always learn. I think that's the thing, is that there's always something you're getting out of it. Information, knowledge.
So when you transition careers, do you find a lot of like contacts kind of carried over? Like when you say you reached out to a bunch of magazines, you're shooting out images and stuff, did that kind of help having known those people in architecture, or what?
No, everything is, everything is bootstrapped financially. Everything is sort of, I wasn't born into, the whatever, glitterati of Milan, those kind. No, unfortunately not. It's all been like muscling my studio and company, every inch of the way. So no, and it's again like a lot of brute force and ignorance, and it's just do it, just reach out, and being open, really, being open and engaging, like coming to a lecture, not that you're coming to mine per se, but that you're going to any lecture. That thing may lead to something else. So I think those are really important things. It's like staying curious, moving beyond, our awful phones that we've got our head too buried in.
Let's go back here and then up here.
Okay.
Yeah.
What made you want to teach, and how does it contribute to your practice?
Oh, that's a great question too. So I had the bizarre and wonderful fortune somehow in my undergraduate class when I was a senior, I got to, I don't know why, act like a TA for an entire group of students. One semester on a project, I can't remember what. But suddenly I found myself in charge of these sophomores, as though I was like the teacher. And there were other actual instructors in the studio, but, and I loved that. I don't know, there was something about it I just absolutely loved. And so I always knew there was something in the back of my head, but it was interesting because when I lived in Italy, as is the system there, I was like, I want to teach. And then the Italians would be like, you can't teach. Oh, you don't have a family member who's an academic? Like, because that's how that system was. So I just kind of like, somehow I let that get into my head. So I just kind of dismissed it. But then I had, again, met some people and, one thing kind of led to another. And I expressed to them, because again, it's initiative. It's this idea of like agency. You have more control than you think you do. And I had met someone who was the director of the ID program at SIAC, School of the Art Institute. And I had said, just point blank, hey, if there are any opportunities for, joining a critique or whatever, teaching, I would love to be considered. And she said, we don't have anything. And then, I don't know, it's maybe a semester or so later, she was like, actually, would you want to co-teach with me? Because I can only have so many credit hours on my, thing or whatever. And so that led to then more things. And at some point, I was teaching as much as I could at SIAC. And I sort of, for financial reasons, I was like, who do I know at UIC? Well, it turns out someone from SIAC had gone to what's now my university. And so I said, hey, are there any opportunities here? And then, so that's kind of how I ended up really kind of getting into it. And I feel like those who get to teach are really privileged. I feel really, I won't speak for the academics in the room. I feel extraordinarily privileged to teach. Not only, it's so satisfying working with students, and it's so enriching, and it's like elite training, because we're having to break down to you design, why your thing doesn't work quite yet, and so it's that constant, it's like, some sort of, it's like keeping your senses sharp. And I think, I really love that, and I love being able to take my practice, my independent, brand and practice into the classroom. And, I very much am inspired by our students and things they come up with and techniques and, just energies and the people they are. So it's very much, I think the biggest thing is me taking my outside world, my professional practice world into the classroom. And really, I run a class about agency and empowerment, basically. And I have the students figure out, what are they into? Why are they into the things they're into? I say, start with Instagram. Show me 5 people you're into and tell me why you're into those people. Where they have to start to deconstruct what they really like. So that they can slowly, over the course of the semester, start to see opportunities for themselves. Like maybe they're doing the zine on the Rezo for another class, but that could be a thing. Like they could do, and it's not about like conquering the world like through entrepreneurship, but just seeing areas where you can participate in design without having to be chosen. Because that's harder to like sit back and hope you're going to be picked. It feels like 8th grade at the lunch table or something, trying to get with the cool kids. Just make your own table.
I think Jaden and Phaidon.
I was wondering what experience you had before your licensing agreement.
Oh, only architecture.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, 0.
Like industry or working experience.
I'd worked in large-scale architecture firms, so like doing towers and like airport terminals and things. But I was always on the schematic end, so I was always on like conceptual end sort of thing. I never was into like the super deep technical. I was always in the front phase, but that was it. And so it was really just it. And I, was able to kind of transition into this because I was, in my case at the time, but this is true of any of you, I was living, breathing design because I was paying attention to it. I was reading about it, reading magazines. Of course, I got to attend the furniture fair because I was living there. But I would make a point every year to go back, even if I wasn't in Milan, to really just continue to build that knowledge base.
You talked a bit about sustainability and timelessness. So to you, what do you see in products or in designs that make them timeless, and how does it influence your products?
I think for me, and this is what I'm trying to really kind of understand a bit in the next couple months, as I have this time off from teaching, actually, this fellowship, but I think it comes down to form. It comes down to this idea of beauty. I think it's that simple. It's this thing, and it's a visceral reaction that we have, and it's going to be different for all of us. But I think there is some collective where we understand, like the Vernon Pantone chair, right? That's not going to be everyone's style, but everyone, I believe, my hypothesis is that everyone will recognize there's something special about it. And so I think that's where we have to get to with what we design.
I think that's probably a good place for us to end, but before we let you go, and before we clap for Felicia, Derek has a message for the group, I think, from the student club.
I guess I could just say it from here. So we have a very special opportunity to meet kind of one-on-one with Felicia here tomorrow at 10 a.m. And she offered up her time to the Vignelli Club, and we've only filled about 6 of those slots. So I will be around if anyone is interested in attending that meeting. It will be 10 a.m. tomorrow on the 4th floor of the Vignelli Center. So I will stay around, and I will take your name down. I have about 25 spots left open. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Felicia, thank you so much. It was an inspiring and delightful lecture.
Well, thank you all for having me.
Thanks everyone for coming, and stay tuned for our next design conversation in a matter of weeks.
Have a great night.